Welcome everybody to Chapter 3 lecture on physical growth and aging across the lifespan. So this chapter is covering from birth throughout later adulthood on what kind of changes are happening physically in the body and what happens as we age. So as usual, I'm just going to kind of go over some of the main things that I want you to focus on, but still read the rest of your textbook to get more information. So this first part, I'm just going to review some of the main physical changes that are occurring over the lifespan, starting with infancy. So this chart right here is showing you how rapidly babies are growing during the first 2 years of life. So we have height in green here and weight in blue. So starting at birth to 1 year, you see this steep incline in both weight and height, and it starts to taper off. Of course, the child is still going to be growing, but just not as quickly as within that first year. So we see the most growth during the first year of life. Chart 2 is showing you right here how the proportion sizes of the body are changing as a person is growing. So the 1/4 up here, this is referring to head size. So a big head accounts for 1/4 of its body size. And then as the child grows, the rest of the body begins to catch up. So you see at 25 years of age, we're at 1/8 of the body size. So that is going back, the first change is obviously we have height and weight changes as we grow. We see the biggest height and weight changes during that first year. And the other thing that's happening is that our body is becoming more and more proportional. With infancy, your textbook talks about how they are developing their systems. So like your bodily systems are integrating and developing a rhythm. So things like eating and sleeping and beginning of infancy are not functioning properly. So that's why babies get up in the middle of the night. They don't sleep through the night because they have to go to the bathroom or they're hungry. And then eventually, as the child ages, they start to sleep through the night because their bodily systems have developed a rhythm of we eat at a certain time and we sleep at a certain time. So that happens with age. Okay, so now we're moving on to preschool and middle school, preschool and middle childhood. So what we see in this age range is steady increases in height and weight. So we're still growing. The body proportions, like I showed in the previous chart, are becoming more adult-like. And we also see more growth in the muscles and bones of the child. So if you look at these charts right here, this is showing you the height changes in this chart and the weight changes here. Boys are in blue and girls are in this orange color. So this is at 2 years old, 3 years old, 4 years old, 5 years old, 6 years old. So we can see that we're growing. And you see that boys in blue, for the most part, are going to be on average heavier than girls and also taller than girls. Moving on to talking about what's happening in adolescence. One of the biggest physical changes happening in adolescence is going through puberty. So puberty is the period when your sexual organs are maturing. So the pituitary gland in our brain, once you hit puberty, it's signaling the other glands to begin producing sex hormones at adult levels. So the sex hormones, which you should have read about before, are the androgens and estrogens. So just note that everybody has both. We all have androgens and estrogens. It's just that for the part, boys have more androgen and girls have more estrogen. So those hormones signal the production of more of the sexual organs. The pituitary gland is also signaling for more production of growth hormones, which is why we see increase in height and weight during puberty as well. So just to go over these charts here are showing you the average onset of puberty, so the different aspects of puberty for both males and females. Um, so on average, girls start puberty around 11 to 12 years old. Boys start later, on average around 13 to 14 years old. So you see some changes in the emotional development as well for girls and boys when they start to go through puberty. So it looks a little different. For girls, whenever they start puberty, the level of hormones that they're experiencing tends to lead to feelings of depression and anger, while for boys, those hormones tend to lead to feelings of anger and annoyance. So we got anger for both, but girls tend to see more depression and boys tend to see more annoyance. So there's a little bit more in your textbook about some specific changes that are happening during puberty that you can read about. Before we move on to late adulthood, I do want to talk about some of the changes that are happening in the brain as well. So for this class, you don't need to know all of the different areas of the brain. I will just give you a couple of points to remember. So an infant's brain has relatively few neuron connections at birth. But during those first 2 years, their brain is going to establish billions of new neuron connections. And as they age, those connections become increasingly complex. So they establish connections anytime they experience something, anytime they learn something new. For example, whenever you learn something, so let's say that you learn how to cook a new meal, that process is establishing new connections for things that you hadn't done before, stuff that you didn't know. So babies are doing this on an extreme level because they're starting off as a blank slate, essentially, and they're learning a lot in those first 2 years of life. So that's promoting their cognitive growth, and it's really important for babies to have a lot of stimulation and attention. Otherwise, they're not going to develop those connections, and that's going to stunt their cognitive growth. So let's really quickly talk about sensitive periods. Sensitive periods is referring to a time in development where factors have their greatest impact. So it could be positive, it could be negative. For this case, we're going to focus on negative impact. And so, like I mentioned, those first 2 years of life for brain development, cognitive development are a sensitive period. So, what would happen if you had a child who, for the first 2 years of their life, maybe even the first 3 or 4, were experiencing extreme sensory deprivation? They weren't getting the attention that they needed, they were not being stimulated. Think about what would happen for their brain development and their cognitive development. So what we would see is that that would result in permanent brain damage and loss of functions. Because children are learning so many skills during their infancy and toddlerhood, even things like social skills, how to talk, motor skills, etc. If they experience deprivation, then that means that they're not learning those things. So they're going to be really behind, and in extreme cases, it can lead to brain damage as well. So the picture that I have up here to apply this information, which normally we would have a discussion in class, I'll just tell you the story now. This is a picture from a Romanian orphanage. So there was a story where there's this orphanage where children were dropped off, usually because they were born with some kind of abnormality or intellectual defect, and essentially there were too many kids there for the staff to take care of. So it really deteriorated, and kids didn't have enough to eat. You can see here they're not fully dressed. They definitely weren't receiving individualized attention, proper nutrition, health care, probably living in dirty situations. So it wasn't good. So when they looked at how these children turned out when they left the home, what they have found is that children adopted after 6 months, so they've been in the orphanage for more than 6 months, had persistent intelligence deficits and mental health issues. So that was a common thing that they found there. Now, if children were adopted before they turned 6 months old, then they found that those children were able to score average on IQ tests, whereas the kids who were adopted after 6 months of age um, they were the ones that showed intellectual disabilities significantly. So that 6 months made a really big difference. If they were adopted before 6 months, that means that they were still able to receive the proper attention, nutrition, and stuff, and it kind of start to reverse the process of all the negative stuff they had experienced before. So the links I have here were from the American Psychological Association and their response to children being held at the Mexican border. So usually in class we would have had a discussion about that and how you can apply the information from your textbook to that situation. Essentially, I was just trying to make the link that that is a depriving situation where they're not receiving the proper nutrition stimulation that they need, and that can have serious mental health issues. Things like TSD, psychotic disorders can develop from that kind of experience. Okay, so moving on to talking about adolescence and brain development, the prefrontal cortex is one part of the brain that you should remember. So the prefrontal cortex is responsible for things like critical thinking and impulse control. So it's a very important part of our brain. It helps you make good decisions, essentially. So the thing about that is that the prefrontal cortex is not fully developed until around 20 years old. So that means that for adolescents who are maybe turning 18 and considered legally an adult, that doesn't mean that their brain has fully developed to adult level. So that can create some issues in society. So again, usually in class, we would have done a discussion on if children and adolescents should be treated as adults in the criminal justice system. So I think I'm going to post that as your assignment for this chapter, and you can have a discussion about that. So note that and then read that section in your textbook, and I'll look forward to reading your thoughts on that. Okay, so I'm going to backtrack to talking about early and late adulthood as far as physical development goes. So for early adulthood, this is actually the time when most people are at their physical best. But this also is the time where people start to notice physical decline and signs of aging. So you start to notice that maybe you're getting gray hair, maybe you can't eat the types of food that you like to eat before because it gives you heartburn or something like that. Maybe you start to notice your knees are hurting a little bit more. The type of exercise you used to do isn't as easy. So while we are at our physical best during early adulthood, we do start to notice those signs of aging, which can be stressful. There is a stereotype that as you get older into later adulthood, that people just kind of sit at home and they don't exercise, but that's not true. Many older adults can't do exercise and still get physically active as they should. It's not recommended that you just sit at home and do nothing. So you can keep yourself healthy even into late adulthood. So on that same thought, psychologists that study the later adulthood population have come up with a new way to talk about age. So functional age is just referring to, chronological age is just referring to how old you are. So when we say late adulthood, you might think 65 or older, but that's really throwing everyone into one bucket of elderly, which doesn't really lead to looking at individuals and how they're aging based on things like um, their their health and what kind of behaviors they had when they were younger and those kinds of things. Because not every person who would be considered elderly is sick or at home or in a hospital. Some of them are physically active still. So there's another term called functional age. So functional age is going to take into account an individual's physical and psychological well-being. So there's three different terms for functional age. So you have young old, which means that the person is healthy and active. And remember, it doesn't matter what their actual age is. So you could be 100 years old, and as long as you are still active, you're still healthy, you can do most things on your own. You don't need help from anyone, like getting dressed or doing your groceries, shopping or cooking for yourself, you would still be considered young old even though you're 100. If you're in the old category, that means that you have some health problems and difficulties with your daily activities. So maybe you just have someone come to your house like once a week and help you clean or cook meals. Maybe you have to go to the doctor more often than usual. But for the most part, you're not sick and bound to a hospital bed. So that's old. So again, if we have a 100-year-old who is physically active every day, goes on a walk every day, does everything by herself, but we have a 65-year-old who needs some kind of care a couple times a week, just because the 65-year-old is younger, that doesn't mean that that person is young old. The 65-year-old that needs help would then be old. So the last category is oldest old, which in that category, you're considered frail and in need of care. So this would be somebody who is maybe in a nursing home full time, bound to a hospital bed, is really sick, those kinds of things. That person would be oldest old. So again, if you're 65, but you didn't take care of yourself when you were younger, maybe you smoked and now you are hospital bound or you have to have full-time care, you would be considered oldest old. So just go over that in your textbook and make sure you understand the difference between functional age and chronological age. And that's just a better way to study that population without lumping everybody into just a category of elderly. Okay, so now we're going to move on to talking about perceptual development. So I put this video in your supplemental video folder, so you can watch this. This is an experiment is talked about in your textbook, so it gives you a good visual of what they're talking about there. But just a couple notes here. As we are growing, we could be better at making sense of the world around us. In order to do that, that requires us to be able to perceive and also to be able to use our senses. So what the video is about the visual cliff. So I'll let you watch that on your own, but it's just about depth perception. Infants' vision is blurry until around 3 months of age. And then at 6 months, their vision is actually 20/20. So our vision is developing pretty quickly. Another thing on infants is that they prefer to look at stimuli that's patterned and that has contrast colors such as black and white. So if you look, do a quick search for infant toys, you might find a lot that are black and white because they like those contrast colors. And they like to look at patterns rather than just solid colors. So like here, you have the checkered pattern, so that might be something you would see on a toy versus just an all white toy. Another interesting note about infants and their vision is that right after birth, they already learn to prefer looking at their mother's face versus other faces. So as humans, we develop that really quickly. That would be important for survival, where being able to recognize someone who's safe, which would be your mom, is really important for the infant's survival. Okay, I have a picture example of the toys here that you can see the muted contrast colors and the patterns. Okay, so now let's talk about sensory changes in late adulthood. So as I have on here, this is a period of decline, not only what we've talked about with physical changes in the body, but also a decline in your senses, which can have psychological consequences because our senses, as we just discussed, are our link to the world. So losing those abilities is going to take away a lot of your freedom. When your eyesight is going out, maybe you can't coordinate as well, you're not going to be allowed legally to drive. That takes away a lot of freedom from people and can be really psychologically distressing. Losing your hearing and not being able to keep up with conversation can lead to feelings of isolation from your family. So think about some of those things that are listed in your textbook and what kind of psychological consequences this period of decline is going to have. Okay, so that is the end of our lecture on physical changes. So please read the rest of your textbook chapter on this and then complete that assignment in your folder for today.